right. So I don't know how long this one's gonna last. Might be, yeah, I could see this being over in like half an hour, maybe more if there are a bunch of questions from chat. But then again, this could be like the thing that I'll do in classes where I'll say, hey, I think we're probably going to get out early today. We've just got to go over this and this and this. And then by the end of class, it's like 5 minutes after we're supposed to get out. So we will see. But the reason I wanted to do the stream today is because I saw that the YouTuber best known by the sobriquet Vaush had released a video of me, released a video about me of him talking about me. So this is it. Anna Kasparian, all caps, isn't moving right. Ben Burgis post cringe, 43,000 views. So I'll get out my harshest critique of this video right away, which is that I don't think adults should use the word cringe as a noun. But otherwise, I was thinking about saying something about this on the show, like the regular show on Monday. But then I watched it, I don't know, early Monday afternoon, California time. And I realized that I probably had too much to say about it to do in the regular show. And I kind of wanted to go through some of the stuff line by line. So I would do a separate stream to do that. Yeah, and I mean, look, I know a lot of people have a lot of strong opinions one way or the other about this guy. Believe it or not, I really don't. I've seen him say things I agreed with. I've seen him say things I disagree with. Last time I think I actually did a video about him was like 2021 with Lance, where we watched his debate with non-compete, and I was actually very much on Vaush's side of that one because I think that non-compete was interpreting historical materialism as meaning that, like, basically you sort of can't have normative moral values that you apply to decide whether or not you support or oppose things, which I think is really confused. It's like I said, that was like Sam Harris for Marxism. And so, even though there was like an example he used that was a little eyebrow raising, mostly I think what Vaush said in that one was right. And as I'm saying that, I'm realizing that's not actually the last video I did about it. The last one, we did do a debate breakdown of his conversation with Danny Bestner about Ukraine. And there, of course, I'm much more on Bestner's side since I'm very much a give peace a chance hippie about that. And, and Vaush is not, for people who are familiar with this guy, he'll use phrases like anarcho-NATOism, and I'm obviously on many levels very unsympathetic to that. But again, I'm not really that concerned one way or the other with this guy as a personality. I wanted to talk about this both because I think in the video he's misunderstanding some of the things I say, and I wanted to kind of push back a little bit and sort of correct some of that about the immediate context. So I am going to talk about the immediate context because I don't want to leave anything out. But also, I think much more than that, like, is what I actually care about much more than the immediate context is some of the larger theoretical points that come up in this video. That where he says that I have class reductionist tendencies, whatever that means. He sort of gives his gloss on materialism versus idealism, which I think involves some real misunderstandings of what's going on there. And I just wanted to take kind of an opportunity to correct some of that stuff, because I think all of that matters much more than the sort of like one person in media getting mad at another person in media because they disagree about a third person in media. Like that stuff kind of makes me tired just saying the sentence. So again, I will address all of that, but I want, if possible, aspirationally, right? I'm saying I hope to keep most of the emphasis on the stuff that matters more, because like even if you have no idea who this guy is and you're not interested in one way or the other, I think those sort of larger issues, the class reductionism, historical materialism, how to think about the difference between social policy and material universal demands in socialist strategy. All those issues are just much innately, I think, much more interesting and important. Okay, so I am going to dive right into this and start watching the beginning of the video.
He loves Anna Kasparian now. He runs defense for her. People on the right love it when somebody obviously shifts the right. I like how people, and including Anna, are like, I'm still on the left. I'm just focusing on economic progressivism. And all the right wingers are like cheering, I saw Ben Burgis doing this as well, and also getting kind of roasted by Juniper, the best poster on Twitter, IMO. I wish I could talk to Ben about this. I guess I could just DM him and ask. I guess I do have that power.
All right, just going to pause the first time to say, yes, you do have that power. Go right ahead. Go right ahead and do that, and I will probably say yes. Depends a little bit about the time and place and format. I'm not really a big fan, and I'm trying to say this in the least judgy way that I can. I'm just expressing a personal preference here. I'm not really a big fan of this sort of free-for-all streamer debates that last for like 2 hours or 3 hours until one of the other person has to be the person who pulls the plug in the conversation, and it's not really clear whose turn it is to talk and all that stuff. I mean, just stylistically, that's just not me. But if we do it with a third-party platform, so there's like a moderator and a preset time limit that we agree to, then I would be happy to have that conversation. I was talking to one of the Vanguard guys the other day. He actually told me this video existed. Would run it. I don't know when I would have seen it otherwise. And he offered to host, and I'd be perfectly happy to do that, even though I actually think they're much more on Vaush's side than mine on the underlying argument. I do actually trust those guys to be neutral in that capacity. So if you want to do that, go ahead and DM me. You do have that power. All right, let's keep watching.
That's a power that I have. Maybe I should. He wasn't really engaging with what Juniper said, though. Anna Kasparian is doing the whole, like, I'm not leaving the left. I'm just going to focus on real issues like economic stuff and leave aside the petty divisive identity politics, blah, blah, blah. And Ben Burgis is defending her, which is weird because Ben Burgis is like a socialist. I know he has class reductionist tendencies, but Ben Burgis is not like a liberal, right? But Anna Kasparian's at most a liberal and is moving away from that too. So I don't know where the alignment is. And then
okay, get interrupt again at that point, and I just said this is the kind of thing I don't want to be consumed with for the whole video, but I do think there are a couple things worth correcting here. So first of all, this idea that Anna was at most a liberal, I think, is just wrong in my experience. In fact, the duration of the time that I've known her has, I've seen her politically shift over the years, and it's not, I think, at all in the direction that he is suggesting. So if you go back and look at my first, I guess my first conversation with her was on the Michael Brooks show when I was doing the debunk segment every week. And there was like, I think 1 or 2 of those where Anna was like the guest, and she stayed on during the post game when we were doing the debunk. And so I talked to her a little bit then. But the first one-on-one conversation I ever had with her was on a show that she used to have on TYT called No Filter in, I think, 2019. Maybe very early 2020, but I'm pretty sure 2019. And in that conversation, we were talking about worker co-ops and capitalism, and you could see her shift already in those conversations. She's later said that, in fact, some of those debunk segments where we were talking about why like liberal piety is about education as a solution to poverty doesn't really make sense, that doesn't work, that, how that started to shift her thinking. And in fact, she came to identify closely enough with, democratic socialism that she, when Michael Brooks was still alive, she and Michael were co-hosting a weekend show together at Jacobin. They talk about, socialism, Marxist stuff there all the time. And, as recently as, I don't know, earlier this year. Like I remember being in a hotel room in Texas in Lubbock. I was getting ready to debate John Miltimore from the Foundation for Economic Education, so a libertarianish think tank, and sending Anna my opening statement for that debate, and her responding with feedback and talking to her about it. And so, and that was like all about that was all about socialism. That was so if you in fact, you can read that opening statement because it was reprinted in Jacobin. It's called "Even When Times Are Tough, Keep Socialism as Your North Star," and that was not that many months ago. And in fact, in Anna's conversation with Adam and Sitch, that a lot of people got mad about because of other things she said, and I've gotten into that before, and I'm happy to today, to the extent that it comes up. She was arguing with Adam and Sitch about single payer and why that was so important. She talked about why labor unions were so important. She said she talked not extensively, but she did about worker co-ops, and sort of some of the need to like go to the kind of foundational problems with the the current economy. And you can, I'm sure, depending on your exact perspective, if you're like a Orthodox Leninist or whatever, like I could understand saying oh, Anna's just a liberal. But I think the clear trajectory in the last few years has to actually, this year's actually become much more socialist. And in that tweet that he was talking about, that that he's got, well, I mean, he just scrolled past it, but that he just had on screen. I think I actually asked for that as graphics. Let me see if I can find this. She said, nope, I don't have it. Anyway, I'll see if I can find it. But in the tweet that he's got on screen there, like the original thing was this, on, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, time's a flat circle, I do not remember, a week or two ago, somewhere in that range, I was watching a clip that TYT had posted the day before. And in that clip, Anna was saying that the sort of big thing the most important thing she's shifted on recently, the sort of issues, she says something like, the biggest change you'll notice is that I really want to move away from culture war. And I really, want to have more emphasis on material issues. And we can talk about different ways that somebody might interpret a statement like that, the way I took it, maybe the way other people took it. We can talk about that as the stream goes on, and I'm happy to have that conversation. But my immediate point was just to say that I find this very funny that at a very time when people are saying, oh, she's moving to the right, what she's describing as her biggest shift is towards sounding like Adolf Reed, or sounding like Norman Finkelstein, or sounding like Cedric Johnson, or sounding like, Bhaskar Singara, sounding like me, frankly, right? People who have spent years saying, oh, we need, less culture war, more class war. And so I find it very funny, that sort of juxtaposition of her saying, hey, this is the biggest way I'm changing, and people saying shifting to the right. And she just kind of sounded like, what she sounded like was the kind of thing that I'll hear several times a week on like this Revolution podcast, or that, I'll say on GTAA, although less frequently, because my emphasis there is mostly on arguing against the right, but we do the intra-left stuff sometimes, or that Adam Proctor and I used to say on Dead Pundit Society all the time. And then actually, I am gonna, this is not gonna be good TV, but I am gonna see if I can find the tweet he was talking about, because yeah, I do want to show you on screen, because I don't think you could really see there on screen the one that he's referring to. Find the fucking thing. Yeah. Yep, I got it. Okay. So so here is stop this screen share, start a new one, screen share. X. I still hate that. That bothers me every time I see that renaming. Okay, so basically the progression is I posted this, that clip of Anna talking about, basically more class war, less culture war, and me saying, I'm sorry, but if you think this is what moving right sounds like, you've lost the plot. But then here's the one that's actually on Vaush's screen in his video. And basically what this is me doing a couple things at once. One is sort of gently mocking the idea that this is some big shift for me. That like, oh, I'm, maybe I'm starting to move to the right too, because I'm saying things like this, which, or I would only be saying things like this because Anna's my good friend or whatever, which is really funny to me. Because I wrote a whole book that was about intra-left critique, very much along these same lines, called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. I started writing it, and I started publicly talking about the fact that I was writing it in fall of 2019. I finished writing it in, I don't know, late spring, summer 2020. Yeah, summer 2020. And it was published in spring 2021. I went on the biggest podcast on the planet, about a year and a half ago, so February 2022, to talk about that book and all the same things people are mad about now I said back then. But somehow it's like the eternal sunshine of the spotless gold that every time certain people see me say these things, it's like I'm saying it for the first time, and they'll start saying, oh, in 6 months you're going to be doing some sort of Dave Rubin why I left the left thing. It's like, what? If every time somebody said that would happen in 6 months, that actually happened, that would have happened a very long time ago. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just a socialist who thinks that the left fucks up and is counterproductive and is too consumed with censoriousness and identity politics, etc. But I do care very much about left-wing social policy, and I do, and I care most of all, right, about changing the distribution of material resources, which I think ultimately requires changing the economic system. So, one of the things I was trying to do with this tweet was to push back against this idea that like I'd shifted somehow, and sort of gently mock that and kind of remind people that this is the exact same shit I've been consistently shouting from the rooftops for several years now. And then the other thing is I wanted to sort of take the opportunity to remind anybody who might think that I don't support progressive social policy that, of course, I always have, right? That's not, so in the tweet, right, I say, hi, I'm Ben. I have socially progressive policy positions. I'm pro-choice, pro-gay and trans rights, etc. My favorite critique of this tweet, by the way, was that etc. is trivializing, which is amazing given a 280 character limit. Like if I'd said I support reforms like free college, Medicare for all, etc., would that be trivializing those? But I think the left's culture of identitarian scolding and purity testing is wildly counterproductive, and it makes strategic sense to emphasize universal material issues. That's 1 out of 2. Then the second one, I continue to say, if this post isn't literally the first thing you've ever seen me say, and any aspect of this package of views comes as a surprise to you, maybe pay closer attention, because it's what I've shouted from the rooftops consistently to the point of tedium for the last 5 years, which is true. Check the receipts. Okay. One of the more frustrating ways that some people misinterpreted this was, well, some people just thought when I said I was pro-choice, pro-gay rights, pro-trans rights, that like I was just lying about that part, that I don't really hold those positions, which is, I think, objectively pretty amazing because, again, I've consistently advocated all of that for years. We can go back to like 2020, and here's what I was writing about abortion for Jacobin then. I wrote this essay about Judith Jarvis Thompson, who wrote the sort of classic philosophical defense of abortion rights, written several other things about abortion rights over the years for Jacobin. Last year, I wrote something about called Texas Republicans Trample Their Own Principles to Attack Trans Kids, that was about the Texas Governor Greg Abbott, criminalizing I'm just going to say puberty blockers. I remember Eric Osgood telling me that that's not the most correct, precise phrase, but I think if I used the most precise phrase, even if I remembered it, people wouldn't know what I was saying. So I think I will just use the more common term, trying to criminalize that, and why I was so opposed to that. Later in the year, in the fall, I wrote about the gay marriage referendum in Cuba. I said Cuba's gay rights vote is a victory for socialist values. And then, so that's one frustrating misinterpretation. Another frustrating misinterpretation is that when I said strategically it makes sense to emphasize universal economic demands, that because I used the word material in there, that I was somehow saying that, well, social policy is immaterial, which we'll get to in the Vaush video. But the really crazy thing about that one to me is if you scroll, so this is the tweet that people are getting that out of, right? It's a two-parter. If you scroll down my timeline, okay, there's one about the Trump indictment, but then literally 2 tweets before the one that people got mad about, there is this. So it was actually originally from July 28th, but I'd retweeted it, right? There's this, which is a general point about class war and culture war from my article today for Jacobin. And in that, I'm going to start to read it. I say, here's the quote. Since I don't know if you can read it on the screen share. It says, policies implemented so the politicians who pass them can score culture war points often have very real material consequences for their victims. That's the first sentence of that. So all of the people in the sort of replies and quote tweets screeching at me that I'm a class reductionist who doesn't understand that reactionary social policies have very real material consequences for their victims. Literally, the thing that I tweeted 2 tweets before the one you're mad about starts with the sentence, policies implemented by politicians who pass them so they could score culture war points often have very real material consequences for their victims. So again, I think that's just a sort of bizarre misinterpretation. I think the point is a pretty straightforward one. Again, this is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people on, sort of my wing of the left have been saying for a long time, that it sort of makes the most sense strategically to focus on universalist economic demands, because those are the things that, that draw in the greatest number of people. And this is the kind of argument I've been making for a very long time. So like 3 years ago during the 2020 Democratic primaries, Michael Brooks and I wrote this article, It's Good That Joe Rogan Endorsed Bernie, and Now We Have to Organize. And one of the points that we made there is that, look, even if Rogan, doesn't agree with us about every social policy issue, what the whole history of the labor movement should tell us is that the best strategy for bringing people into a broader coalition is to bring them in with the issues with the widest appeal, right? Not just the ones that people with some cultural sensibilities will agree with and people with others will disagree with, but the ones that will tend to sort of have broad appeal among working class people in general. And then once you've drawn them in, you keep working on convincing them of the stuff that you disagree with them on. Okay, I'm going to pause to just browse through the chat for a second because it is very active here. So want to I agree with you, Shani. I think it has moved left over the last couple of years. There's Strom, thank you for the super chat, says, what's wrong with class reductionism? Well, I think it depends what you mean by it. We're going to get to that. Vaush read the opening of the Communist Manifesto. Yeah, I don't know what he's read or not read, whatever. But yeah, I think that like terms like class reductionism, I think it's worth like really taking a step back and being like, okay, exactly what do you mean by that? Because the differences, I think, are going to be important. Okay, let me just scroll. Yeah, Charles says trans rights are a material issue. Yeah, I think it depends what you mean. I think that the issue with material consequences, yeah, like I said, literally 2 tweets before, I said that explicitly, right? That's I don't, obviously I agree with that. But again, I think there's this sort of people saying it makes sense to emphasize universalist economic demands as your sort of primary axis of organizing, for strategic reasons. Sort of saying that is like, oh, so you're saying these other issues are like immaterial or unimportant. I think is a seems like a very wildly uncharitable interpretation. It's certainly a wrong one. Let me just say that. Scroll. Okay. All right, so I am going to go back to I'm going to go back to the Vaush video and watch. Yeah, trying to think whether I want to say anything more about the Anna part right now. I might say a little bit more in a minute, but let me go back to the Vaush video first.
And Juniper asked, "Can you explain to me why trans people losing medical rights in states like Florida isn't a material issue?" And Ben Burgis said, "When on earth have I ever said such a thing? You're just making shit up." And then Juniper said, "I was curious because you seem to be reducing what trans activists and people are talking about as, quote, identitarian scolding, as if Anna giving validity to right-wing framing of discourses of birthing people isn't identitarian. Her entire complaint comes from reactionary framing. Additionally, you are framing this as an issue of trans rights versus material issues when they are inextricably linked together, so I was wondering why you seem to separate them." And then Ben Burgess said, "Again, you're just making shit up. I never suggested it wasn't material." And then Juniper responded to that, and then Ben Burgess didn't respond to that. So it's like he's not even engaging with what she's saying. So I don't.
Yeah, I find the complaint here really confusing because, because Vaush read out all of my tweets, and nowhere in any of those tweets am I saying any of the things Juniper is attributing to me. So yeah, if somebody attributes something to you and you say, "Hey, I'm not saying that. I never said that. I don't think it. Why are you attributing this to me?" And then they go back and they attribute something else to you that you also didn't say, then yeah, of course you're going to stop engaging. I mean, it's like eventually, you're going to stop engaging with a brick wall. Given, that, again, I think a lot of this comes from a conflation between sort of morally, what do we think is an important issue? So like if a left-wing politician is elected to office, is it important to us that on principle they vote a certain way about it, et cetera? And then like strategically what it makes sense to put primary emphasis on, which are two separate issues, but I think oftentimes in this kind of internet discourse about it, really gets lost. And I think if I say explicitly I support trans rights, and I also, and then I say I don't think identitarian scolding is helpful, and they say, "Oh, so you're reducing trans rights to identitarian scolding," it's like, no, I'm saying the opposite of that, right? I'm saying that the policy is important to me. Getting mad about people about sort of language choices, that you have like a 2 months hate over somebody saying that they don't like one particular language choice, like the birthing persons example. That seems silly to me. There's a lot of this stuff is, again, I think that there's, and this is not, I think, by any means exclusive to arguments about trans issues. I think this comes up in general, that there is, I think, unfortunately, a culture in much of the left of this sort of constant scolding and purity testing, where people play all these social status in group games, where it's like you kind of get points for denouncing people and for getting to start your sentence with "speaking as a" and all that stuff. I find all of that massively unhelpful. None of that has anything to do with the policy issues, on which I suspect Vaush, me, Juniper, Anna would agree like 97%. Again, we can get more into that, but I want to watch more of the video.
I don't know what's going on. He's not even like engaging with the talking point here. I feel like you should always be really suspicious of lefties who go on the material issues diatribe, because all issues are material. There is no separation between identity and material issues, because people's identities are the axes along which they are materially discriminated against. Like you can't argue, well, race isn't a material issue. What the do you mean? Race is like the anchor around which like 98% of like coded economic discourse in this country takes place. What do you mean? Like basically every economic policy that's ever been made since the 1950s has been in some way, shape, or form like affected by racial politics. There's no, I mean, before the 1950s as well, but still, you know, there's no meaningful separation here.
Yeah, I guess I don't really know what any of that means at the end of the day. When you start saying whether race is or isn't a material issue, I don't know what it means to talk about race as an issue. Do you mean racism? Do you mean racial discrimination? Like, you know, I mean, race doesn't exist. It's a pseudoscientific concept. Racism certainly exists. And at various times and in various ways, racial discrimination has certainly existed, and you know certainly has long effects that last long after the de jure discrimination ends. But I think just talking about like race as an issue is kind of hopelessly confused. You know, I mean, I think that it is certainly the case that people will act on any sort of beliefs that they have to a certain extent, including racist beliefs. I mean, race itself is an abstraction. This is the sort of point that a lot of anti-essentialist Black Marxist scholars have made. People like Adolph and Touré Reed, people like Cedric Johnson, people like the Field Sisters, you know, people like our friends at This Is Revolution, etc. Like, this is the kind of point they make all the time. I think this is just kind of an unhelpfully muddled way of saying it. And I think, I guess, okay, so this is good. This is like really getting us into the first thing that's not just kind of he said, she said about, you know, whether some third person is good or bad, or, you know, what I said or didn't say in some tweet, but like it's like a kind of more meaty, more substantive issue. And we're already half an hour in, so my time estimate at the beginning was just hilariously wrong, which I kind of knew that might happen. But in any case, this is the first kind of meatier issue. So I do want to just dwell on this for a minute, because when you say race is a material issue, I mean, again, if what you just mean is there are things that people will be motivated to do by racial ideology that have material consequence, yeah, nobody disagrees with that. It's not like Adolph Reed disagrees with that. But if you're saying, my problem with it is that there are a few different things that you could mean by that, and I think it's really analytically important to separate them out, right? Because I think certainly most liberal race discourse in the United States is really all about having a more diverse ruling class, and is really all about the politics of disparity, right? So I've mentioned Adolph Reed a couple of times. I always think of this article he wrote in Non-Site, I want to say last year, where he recounts this argument that he got into with the host of a Black nationalist radio show, where, you know, when he was on the radio show, the host, you know, he was like making the point that most, you know, the sort of obsession with the racial wealth gap misses most of the point, because most of that gap is actually at the top. That it's mostly just that there are more, you know, wealthy white people than wealthy non-white people. Not entirely. There is a disparity in poverty also, but that's where like the bulk of the money in the racial wealth gap is. And you know, Professor Reed is arguing that this sort of misses the point to put most of your emphasis on that as a sort of social justice issue, because you're sort of obscuring the fact that most non-wealthy people, certainly most working class people of all races, have fundamentally allied interests that you know, Black workers and, you know, Black capitalists don't share. Black workers and white workers do share. And the Black nationalist radio host, I don't remember if he ever said his name in the article, said, well, okay, but there's so much more white collective wealth than Black collective wealth. And Adolph had this wonderful line in response about how, you know, I really want to know how this white collective wealth works. If you're like a waitress in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and you're having trouble, you know, making rent, can you hit up Elon Musk for a donation from the White Collective Wealth Fund? You know, this is like an unhelpful distraction, right? Now, I'm sure Vaush So I've certainly seen him call himself a socialist. So I'm sure he'd say, no, I don't just want a more diverse ruling class. But I think that when you just talk about race as an issue without sort of doing a lot more analytic work than that to be clear on what you mean, I think there's at least a danger that you're sort of muddling the difference between that kind of race politics and what we should want, which is a socialist society that's, of course, racially egalitarian, doesn't have any discrimination, et cetera. But, that sort of sees, there are these material disparities that are part of the long-term result of Jim Crow, but ultimately we don't want a society where, the right demographic percentage of every group is living in poverty and going to substandard schools and being subject to, living in neighborhoods that are subject to militarized policing and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the right percentage of every group is on top and the right percentage is in the middle, right? What we want is to flatten that hierarchy. And I know that, reads like class reductionism to many people, again, whatever that means exactly. But I think it is actually an important thing to sort of plant your flag on, that even the kinds of issues that people often sort of apply this word race to talk about, which are really oftentimes issues about poverty. Certainly the issue about policing and criminalization, there's an element of direct racial bias in there, but I think, that certainly with certainly when you talk about like police shootings, any prejudice that's in an officer's head is, if they're making a split-second decision about pulling the trigger, is going to play some role there. But the great majority of the reason for the disparity is that this kind of militaristic policing is something that happens in poor neighborhoods, and for obvious historical reasons, given Jim Crow, et cetera, Black Americans are more likely to live in those neighborhoods than white Americans. But yeah, I mean, this is the point of Cedric Johnson's very good book, After Black Lives Matter. It's a mistake to sort of see that issue through a primarily racial lens rather than seeing it through a primarily class lens. And I think sort of saying, well, race is a material issue, I think obscures that analysis in a way that I find really unhelpful in terms of building the kind of emancipatory politics that we need, the kind of politics that could sort of break through the existing impasse and actually mobilize a majority of working class people of every demographic group to fight for the kind of society that would actually do away with a lot of these issues in a lot of different ways, right? So that would be, I hope that was clear. That would be my critique of that part. I am just scrolling through the chat. I think a lot of that is just intra-chat arguments, so I'm not going to weigh in on it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There are also some of the micro controversies about the Anna stuff that I just can't speak to because these are like details of segments that I haven't watched. So, that's why those chat comments I'm not picking up on, just because, I don't know. Send me the link and I'll watch it and I'll comment on it, but I'm not going to right now. Okay, I'm going to watch more of Vaush.
I hate that framing. I don't care for it at all. Go back to 1940s and tell people that tell Black people race is immaterial. You should tell them today. You mean material in the sense that the problem stemmed from something physical? No, like, okay, for some reason, and I don't know why this started, okay? Lefties started saying material issues as a way of linking their analysis to historical materialism, apparently not realizing that historical materialism is just a contrast to like the Hegelian dialectic, and that means that in a material sense, they're literally just referring to facts of the world, as in facts of the world and the material holdings of the different economic classes are what determine the progress of history. That's historical materialism. So when they say material issues, what they mean is issues happening in reality.
I'm going to unmute myself. I do this for a living, don't I? And then I'm going to pause there because every single thing that Vaush just said is wrong. I really want to emphasize that. It's not that he's a little bit wrong about some of this, but it's like, since I hit play the last time to when I hit pause, every single thing that he said is wrong. And I want to try to break down as much of that as I possibly can in a reasonable amount of time. So first of all, when he says lefties started to say material issues because of something about historical materialism, no, that's wrong. I think that any connection between those two subjects is a lot more indirect than he's portraying it as being. I think, I mean, certainly, well, I can certainly say what I meant because I wrote the tweet that he's mad about here. But I think in general, I think that I think the historical materialism part is a little bit of a different subject, although, again, I cannot emphasize too much how everything he just said about it is wrong, or almost everything, certainly. I guess I have to go back and watch that part again to see if it's literally everything like I just said. So first of all, remember the phrase that I used that, got a certain segment of left Twitter mad was universal material issues, right? So, in other words, universalist economic demands. And this is actually a bit of a separate subject from the historical materialism stuff that he's trying to link it to. I think he is making a mistake there. But let me, just to recap my perspective on this, I want to go back to that screenshot. So this is the thing I was saying is 2 tweets before the one that he's getting mad about here. And it's a screenshot from, I think the next to last article I wrote in Jacobin. Here's what I say there. Policies implemented so politicians who pass them can score culture war points often have very real material consequences for their victims. What defines the culture war as a whole, though, is that for most of its combatants, the battle lines are drawn not over material interests, but cultural sensibilities. All the issues listed above, and that's from earlier in the article, will tend to divide people in ways that run through economic classes rather than tending to pit one class against another. In other words, yes, obviously social policies have material consequences for the people they affect. Like an obvious example would be like anti-discrimination or anti-abortion laws for that matter, right? Not being able to end a pregnancy, or a trans person not getting the healthcare that they need, or just like or again, just laws against various forms of identity-based discrimination. All these things obviously have material consequences for the people that they impact. But the point is that most people who, when they start to have opinions about abortion, for example, or when they start to have opinions about, like trans rights controversies about sports or puberty blockers or other things like that, in most cases, what's motivating them is not their material interests. Because, for some of these, at least, we're talking about, the sort of victims or, a small minority of society. It doesn't mean they don't matter. It does just mean that most people aren't part of that. So most people aren't forming their opinions on the basis of this. Most people are forming their opinions on the basis of cultural sensibilities, how they feel about, family, when they think that life begins during pregnancy, when they, like all of this stuff is sort of more abstract and ideological for most people. And there's no particular guarantee that, what your economic position is going to lead you to have one position or another on most of these issues. Again, if you're reading any of this as an argument that none of this stuff is like morally important or that we should back off an inch on any of the policy questions, then you either can't read or you choose not to, because that's not what I'm saying. But this is just a bit of strategic analysis. So I continue to say, none of that means that the left can or should avoid taking positions on important social policy issues. Again, some people are dedicated to just ignoring the sentences that contradict the straw man that they want to argue against. I'm going to stop noting that just because it's exhausting and tedious at a certain point. So none of that means the left can or should avoid taking positions in important social policy issues, but it does mean that on a strategic level, if we're going to defeat the right wing and be in a position to implement better policies on every issue, Our job is to find ways to change the channel every chance we get to issues with the potential to rally the support of working class people in general based on shared material interests. By contrast, both conservatives and neoliberals who benefit when the political conversation steers away from the issues where neither side has much to offer most ordinary people of any demographic. Neither major party wants to talk about why the US government doesn't guarantee healthcare as a fundamental right and why instead it spends its money on sowing chaos and destruction abroad. But the pride flags and the military bases, again, this callback to something earlier in the article, that's a fight they're happy to have until the end of time. So that's the point about material issues, that the sorts of issues that I think are make the most strategic sense to emphasize are ones that cut as much as possible, that tend as much as possible to mobilize people of one class against those of another based on their shared interests, rather than only tending to unite, the people who have a certain set of cultural and ideological assumptions. Again, not because the other stuff doesn't matter. This is the point, that like Michael and I were making back in 2020 about the Rogan endorsement, et cetera, that like, I don't know, I always tell people to watch that there's a James Earl Jones movie from like 30 years ago, maybe, called Mattawan, about the coal wars in West Virginia, that I think correctly portrays a lot of the miners involved in those strikes as having all sorts of racial and ethnic prejudices, et cetera. But sort of seen for pragmatic reasons that they had to work with other kinds of workers who they might have prejudices against, et cetera. And over the course of shared struggle, overcoming some of those prejudices, which frankly I think is just a much more effective strategy historically than sort of trying to say, no, everything is always a package deal immediately. We're not willing to, like, you stay out into the cold until all of your attitudes are perfect. I think that's a very ineffective strategy. I think like drawing people in based on the issues that tend to assemble the biggest majority and then working on persuading them on everything that you disagree with about, I think makes the most sense. And I also think when you're trying to persuade people of everything else, I think if you immediately go to a place of denunciation, if you play all of the stupid identity games that the too much of the left likes to play, the speaking as a games, the micro-policing of language, sort of looking for offense so you can play these social status games within the left, I think all that stuff is incredibly toxic and counterproductive, which again, nobody should be surprised by if you're watching this, because I've been consistently saying all of the above for several years. None of this is new. Okay. So again, I think he's just radically misunderstanding the context of the point about universal material issues, as saying that social policy doesn't have material consequences, or as like an attempt to sort of connect up to historical materialism in some kind of immediate way, which, again, I don't think these are entirely unrelated issues. Because certainly one of the things you get out of historical materialism is that the sort of most effective lever for historical change is appealing to material interests rather than appealing to more ethereal cultural and ideological sensibilities. But again, I think what he thinks historical materialism is, I think is just radically wrong. So I actually want to back up a minute to watch just a little bit of that again, because again, I think this is just very, very incorrect.
To like the Hegelian dialectic, stem from something physical. No, like, okay, for some reason, and I don't know why this started, okay? Lefties started saying material issues as a way of linking their analysis to historical materialism, apparently not realizing that historical materialism is just a contrast to like the Hegelian dialectic, and that means that in a material sense, they're literally just referring to facts of the world, as in facts of the world and the material holdings of the different economic classes are what determine the progress of history. That's historical materialism. So When they say material issues, what they mean is issues happening in reality, which are all issues.
No. Okay. So I want to get into the historical materialism stuff, but that last sentence just could not be more wrong. When they say material issues, they just mean issues happening in reality? No. When you say material issues, what you're talking about are issues about how material resources are distributed, about the distribution of wealth, ultimately about the distribution of economic power. And there are certainly social policy questions that have consequences for that. But that's, I think that, again, I think if you think about this is why in the tweet that universal prefix is really important, that, that you talk about universal material issues, because again, the things that I think are the sort of most effective organizing tools for the left are universalist demands. In other words, demands not that some people should get something because of their particular status or background or identity, we need more, we need more female Black CEOs, but rather that everybody should get something just for being a person, because those are the things I think that, again, have the sort of ability to reach out to the broadest sort of subset of working class people and get them on board. Not everybody, of course. There's no strike without scabs, or almost none. But the broadest possible subset, I think, are what you're going to get on board there. So just I think part of the confusion, both Vaush's confusion about what people mean when they say material issues, and then also part of the confusion about what historical materialism means, I think comes from confusion between two levels of analysis, two things that you might mean by material or materialism. So one way of using the word material is just to mean physical reality. So if you talk about materialism as opposed to dualism in the philosophy of mind, you're talking about saying, well, everything that exists is part of physical reality, but that has nothing to do with what historical materialism means. And it also has nothing to do with what material issues means in this context, right? So material issues in this context means primarily issues about how resources and economic decision making are distributed. But the material and historical materialism means something really specific. And I'm actually going to give Vaush and anybody else who wants to take it a reading recommendation right now. Obviously, there's no substitute for reading Marx and Engels themselves in the long term. I hope everybody eventually graduates to doing that as much as possible. Everybody should read Capital. The first few chapters are hard going, but then it really does get much easier as it goes on. And frankly, parts of it that are going to blow your mind. It's really, really good, right? But if you just want a very clear and very accessible but very rigorous introduction to historical materialism, I've heard it claimed, I don't know if it's true, that Vaush isn't really into that reading theory that much, that he'll make the occasional self-effacing comment about it. But Vaush, man, if you do want to read a little bit of theory, this is a really good, really accessible starting point. So this is a book called Karl Marx's Theory of History, A Defense, by my boy Jerry Cohen, G.A. Cohen. And it's very clear. The first chapter has a nice overview of Hegel's philosophy of history that would correct a lot of what he's about to say. And then again, just very good, rigorous unpacking of and defense of Marx's theory of history. And so let's just talk about Marx's theory of history. What does Marx mean by historical materialism? Well, the material there has a really specific meaning. It doesn't just mean anything that has to do in one way or another with physical reality, which would be everything, in which case materialism would be a very vacuous claim, right? That would only sort of, that would only be a contrast to I don't know, again, views of history that involve God or, invisible spirits or something like that. But it's much more interesting than that. It's not just that vacuous contrast. Material means something really, really specific in the context of Marxist historical materialism. When Marx says that the sort of primary factors you have to understand the kinds of historical changes he's most interested in, which are changes from one mode of production to another, from feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to socialism. When he says that, well, the things that are really in the driver's seat here are these material factors, the kinds of material factors he has in mind are very, very specific. What he's talking about are the forces of production and the relations of production. So the forces of production is Marx's phrase for essentially the capacity of a society to produce stuff. Factories are forces of production. Farms are forces of production. Given how broadly Marx uses the word production, like he actually says at one point in Capital, I think it might be at a footnote or something, that like the fish in the ocean are part of the fisherman's means of production. That when the fisherman turns a fish in water into a fish on land, right, that counts as a kind of production for Marx. So like truckers, even if you're involved in distribution, you're selling coffee at Starbucks, right? That's all production. But so the forces of production are the capacity of a society to produce stuff, and then the relations of production are how the producing stuff is organized. So do you have lords and peasants, where the peasants have feudal obligations to stay on a certain piece of land, and there's some plot of land they have some property rights to, but then they have to give up some of the product to the lord? Do you have slaves and slave owners, where the slave owns nothing, and all they get back from what they produce is what the slave owner needs to give them back for food and shelter, and they're not allowed to leave? Do you have workers and capitalists, where the worker is legally free? They can make a contract with anybody who wants to make a contract with them. But in Marx's phrase, they're doubly free. They're also free from having any means of supporting themselves besides selling their working hours to a capitalist. And Marx's analysis is that ultimately in all of these systems, whoever the ruling class is, whether it's feudal lords, whether it's slave owners, whether it's industrial capitalists, are ultimately engaged in extracting surplus labor from the immediate producers, your peasants, your workers, your slaves, which means that, okay, there's a certain number of hours you might have to work anyway just to support yourself. But then after that, you're also forced, whether you're forced at the point of a sword, as in feudalism or slavery, or you're forced through the dull compulsion or the mute compulsion of economic necessity, as in your capitalism, you need to work to eat. You're forced to give up. You're forced to work these extra hours, not to enrich yourself, but to enrich, essentially your boss. And so what historical materialism is, and this gives you a little bit of a simplification. Again, you want the complicated version. Cannot recommend this book strongly enough. Karl Marx's Theory of History by G.A. Cohen. But the slightly simplified version, and I hope you can see the difference between this and what Vaush is saying, is that historical materialism says that ultimately the relations of production are downstream from the forces of production. In other words, how advanced the forces of production are is going to tell you what kind of mode of production, in other words, what set of relations of production is even possible. So, if you have like a primitive communist society, in other words, like hunter-gatherer tribes with no class distinctions, could be that you can't really have much in the way of class distinctions because you can't really have a class of non-producers. You can't have a class of aristocrats who aren't hunting or gathering, or else there wouldn't be enough food to go around. People would start going hungry. Once you've got the agricultural revolution, then you start to get these pre-capitalist forms of class society, like feudalism, like ancient slave societies, where you can produce enough to support a class of non-producers, but only if, but the only way to do it is by using direct force, direct coercion to get people to be working for them all the time, or else, given the level of development of the forces of production, it wouldn't work. And then once you've got the Industrial Revolution, you have capitalism. Well, now instead of having what you had under feudalism, which is that you needed a workforce that you just needed to, convince them that God wanted them to stay on the land all the time. I know like medieval historians are cringing at this cartoonish oversimplification, but I think it's really good enough for what I'm doing right now. That you just need to sort of get the peasants to stay, to stay planted to this piece of land all the time. So they're spending their time, when they don't get, they get a bunch of saints days off and stuff, but otherwise they're spending all their time sowing and harvesting and whatever to keep it going. Now, when you've got the Industrial Revolution, you've got the rise of this new capitalist ruling class that acts through markets, and now you have the sort of needs of the system are for this new ruling class. They don't need that kind of feudal labor force. What they need is a mobile labor force, a labor force that can move around and sign contracts with whoever will have them, but are still but don't own any means of production themselves, so they still have no realistic choice except to rent themselves out to the people who do. And it's certainly true that Marx starts out as a Hegelian. I think in kind of the opposite way to Vaush. I remember Charlie Kirk in my debate with him was very confused about this too. Charlie seemed to think that Marx stayed a Hegelian his whole life in a way that he didn't really exactly. I think Vaush might be actually making the opposite mistake in some of the stuff we're going to watch. He's overstating the difference. But Hegel has this analysis of history that has all the stuff that Marx likes, has this dialectical approach, and that word dialectics means different things to different people. I don't want to do it an injustice by trying to summarize it too quickly, but I think certainly at least part of what it has meant is sort of being attuned to the ways that systems are in flux, that if you want to think about how they're in flux and how they're constantly changing, you should be attuned to the sort of internal tensions within them. There's like a lot that Marx likes about that, but ultimately Hegel does have this view of all of that, according to which history is the world spirit, which is sort of ambiguously identified with Christian God, sort of coming into itself over the course of history. And it's going to be, even though there are suggestive similarities, certainly in the way that Hegel thinks that a lot of the development of history is about humans becoming independent of nature in a certain way. It's certainly not going to be about those material forces like forces of production and relations of production. And certainly it's not going to be what Marx thinks, since what really led Marx to this view, if you read his 1859 preface, where he sort of lays this all out, is that, okay, the forces of production are ultimately upstream of the relations of production. And then the legal and political institutions of society, right? That's the original meaning of the superstructure. Marx never talks about an ideological superstructure. That's like Althusser. The legal and political superstructure is ultimately downstream of the relations of production. That, what kind of laws, what kind of political system you have is going to depend on what's going to, what's going to sort of grow out of that sort of more basic way that society is organized. And of course, everything I've said in this very quick, I hope at least reasonably clear explanation of what historical materialism actually means has been about forms of class society. But of course, Marx's analysis, this, by the way, is why, Marx would be so horrified by degrowtherism. Marx's analysis is that the level of material abundance that's created by capitalism creates for the first time the possibility for a more democratic, collective, egalitarian society that's not just sort of a more egalitarian distribution of crumbs from which class relations could very easily arise again, but instead you could have a more egalitarian form of abundance. In other words, you could have socialism through social ownership of the means of production. I know that was really long, but again, the sort of explanation of historical materialism in this video really hurt me. So I wanted to get into that at maybe more length than people are interested in hearing. But again, I at least hope that people got something out of that. Okay, let me just scroll through the chat to see if there's stuff that I am yeah, again, if you're talking about whether race is material or immaterial, I think you're just missing what the word material means in the context of historical materialism, right? You're talking about, force of production, relations of production. That's the material that Marx is talking about, which is not even really the same meaning as material when you talk about like universal material issues. Is the most effective way of organizing a socialist movement, of organizing the working class. But neither of them really have anything to do with Vaush's way of using the word material when he's explaining historical materialism, which is just like everything that has anything to do with the physical reality. Adorno is better than Marx. That's like an inch from getting you banned from GTAA, but I'll allow it. Kushlik says the only solution is solving things. Hard to argue with that. Yeah, here we go. The only solution is solving things. I like it. I like solving things. Yeah. So far, so good. Force of production, relations production. Yeah. I think Marx is actually a little bit ambiguous about how he uses the phrase mode of production. So sometimes, like, I don't think, like, I think you're right. Sometimes he uses it in that combined sense where he's talking about both the material mode, like, because, mode of production could mean a lot of things. Like, that's just mode of production, just means like how production is happening. Like, there's a good line in this book where Cohen is explaining it, where he says, like, if you talk about my mode of cooking, what do you mean? Do you mean, whether I'm cooking over a fire or using a gas stove or an electric stove? Do you mean whether I'm making Italian food or Indian food? Do you mean whether I use a lot of spices, right? Like, we have to clarify. So I think Marx uses the phrase mode of production in different places in at least three different ways. One of them is like the material mode of production, which is more or less like how the actual forces of production work. So in that sense, like a Soviet collective farm in 1970 and a Iowa agribusiness kind of farm in 1970 might have been exemplifying very much the same mode of production. But of course, he also means the social mode of production, which is essentially, which I think is actually the main way he mostly uses it, which means, what the level of development is, the forces, like actually how physically production is happening. So that's the sense in which the Iowa and Ukraine farms in 1970 would have the same mode of production. That, like, because a lot of Marx's project in Capital is to sort of differentiate which aspects of how production works under capitalism are specific to the capitalist mode of production in the sense of social mode of production, and how much is just like sort of material facts that would be true even if you change the mode of production tomorrow. So yeah, social mode of production means like what the relations of production are, the sort of total set of relations of production. But I do think you're right. He sometimes uses it in this combined sense to mean both at the same time. Okay, scrolling. A lot going on in the chat. Not seeing. Yeah. I don't know. There's somebody saying Dubois is much more relevant on this topic. I don't know. I think Dubois might disagree with some of what I'm saying less than you think, especially late communist Dubois. People always quote that thing about the Dubois talking about the psychological wages of whiteness in a way that really misses the fact that he's not doing proto-white privilege theory. In fact, his point is precisely that these like psychological wages are fool's gold. They're tricking white workers into doing things that go against their actual interests. It's another reading recommendation: Democracy Against Capitalism, Renewing Historical Materialism by Ellen Meikson's Woods. Let's see. RT Wager says, so thank you for the Chew super chat. Says, thank you for being practical. No war but class war. Some stuff about Marxism, Leninism, and Emma Goldman, all of which I think is going to get us pretty far off topic. Pudding Miser says trans rights are absolutely universal material issue. No is free till everyone is free. I think there's a confusion here about a sort of moral position in favor of trans rights, which I obviously agree with, and a sort of strategic consideration. And I think those are being sort of melded together in a really unhelpful way in that kind of comment, because it's like, again, the point is not like universal means like morally important and, particular means not morally important. It's just it's a strategic question. What's going to sort of be the thing that sort of makes sense to emphasize as much as possible in order to build the largest coalition so you can achieve all of your objectives on every issue, including social policy, which you're going to get, much better social policies if the left is in power than if it's not. Okay. Thank you, Tia, for the super sticker. Really appreciate that. Solidarity. Stuff about revisionism. This is a deep cut to something Haas said during our debate, that because he'd yelled loudest or something, he was taking my PhD, which is funny. I'm not. I'm kind of the last. I'm probably the single person who has a PhD who's least likely to bring it up. In any case, he can have it if he wants. So a lot of stuff going on here. I can't find the chat anymore. There's something about Anna's views about crime. Again, I think, I've talked to her about this a bunch of times. I think that a lot of people maybe have a misleading impression of some of her views. But I'm not going to try to speak for her. She can speak for herself. I will just say, if you want to know what I think about some of the crime stuff, you can read an article I wrote in the Daily Beast called "The Left Needs a Better Message About Crime," where I argue that I think that we're making a mistake when we sort of dismiss concerns about public safety as propaganda, or sort of stigmatize anybody who's making too big a deal about street crime or public safety as being automatically reactionary. I think that, look, even a relatively minor uptick in crime relative to the 90s is still a big deal to a lot of working class people. This consistently comes out in polls. Like, for example, even in polls specifically just of black voters, they always give these options like, do you think the police presence in your neighborhood is too much, too little, or about right? And too much is always by far the least popular answer, because even though people know that cops can be racist and abusive and et cetera, I have no love for the capitalist state. I think these concerns about, safety on the streets are very real and vivid concerns to a lot of working class people. And when I see a version of the left that I think has very shallow roots in the working class sort of dismissing those concerns, I think that's a mistake. Now, that doesn't mean that I think we should support some kind of god-awful 1990s Bill Clinton kind of tough on crime nonsense. I would totally be against that. I think Anna would be too, but whatever. I think instead what we should be talking about is what we should be emphasizing at every opportunity is that a left economic program would actually do more than anything else in the long run to diminish crime, which is not to say that I think that we'd have like zero crime even in like an advanced socialist society. I don't think that's very realistic, that like rape and domestic abuse or just sort of murder coming from interpersonal conflicts would ever completely disappear. But the kind of crime that like really drives like crime rates and violent crime rates, like gang violence, I absolutely think is mostly economic in its ultimate causes, right? You don't see a lot of kids from the suburbs joining gangs. There's a reason. There's a reason why a country like Norway can have both a vastly more humane criminal justice system than ours and also a much lower rate of violent crime. And it's not because the culture is nicer. You know, if you go back far enough in history, you will find that Nordic culture is not innately nicer. It's because of the victories of the workers' movement in those countries that have won this giant welfare state and big labor unions that do sectoral bargaining and all these things that create a society that does a much better job of meeting everybody's material needs, even if it's not all the way at the goal yet. It's not at that North Star of false socialism. It's still capitalist, but it's come much further along. Okay, scrolling. Steve Paxton said Ellen Meiskin's Wood is definitely worth reading. Hi, Steve. Origin of Capitalism and Liberty and Property, both interesting books. Baki, moviegoer, thank you for the super sticker. I've been much more of a moviegoer since I moved to LA because there are like constant screenings of old movies. I went to see Rosemary's Baby and Los Feliz last night. It was amazing. I love that movie so much. Shani, thank you for the super sticker. Matt says, I like the realistic pessimism about crime post-class society. I don't know that I like it, but I do think it's correct. Okay. All right. So I think I'm all caught up on that. Let's go back to a few more minutes of Vaush.
There are no issues happening outside of reality. What does that mean? Like, I don't know. They say like material issues, meaning like gas prices or something. But from a materialist frame point, all of this is like, it's not as though Marxist analysis of history would discount race as an axis of change. Like that Marx wrote about this, you know? So yeah, like I don't know why. Yeah. They issue it's like, well, there's material issues and imaginary issues. There's no such thing as an imaginary issue. It's all material from a Marxist frame point. Material doesn't mean it has to have a physical. It's
okay. Sorry, I know that was like 10 seconds, but there were two things in there I really need to respond to. Again, when he's talking about Marx writing about race, I think I know what he's talking about, but I think he's missing the point. And I think saying like, and this is the problem. This is the reason why, like, again, our friends at This Is Revolution are always railing against Afro-pessimism, this sort of view that there's this ontological category called race that's transhistorical, and like white supremacy is just this transhistorical thing where like essentially nothing has changed since like the 1850s or 1619, whatever. And I think that's just very deeply misguided. When he's talking about Marx writing about race, I think he's talking about is Marx writing about slavery. So Marx famously says, you know, for obvious reasons, Marx is a very enthusiastic supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party and the struggle to end the institution of slavery, both for moral reasons, right, because it's the most despicable system that's ever existed in human history, and also for strategic reasons, right? So when Marx says labor in white skin can't be free while labor in black skin is in chains, he's not people will sort of pick up that quote and will use it as this very decontextualized kind of transhistorical, Marx is saying we need to talk more about race or something. It's like, no, this is meant literally, right? That as long as you have slave labor, there's only so much progress that free labor can make, not in some kind of abstract, none of us are free until we're all free kind of moral sermon way, but in a very literal way that slave labor can be used to undercut the bargaining power of free labor. So the working class has a vested interest in the struggle to end slavery above and beyond the moral reasons that any decent human being would support that struggle. But saying Marx wrote about race is if what we were talking about when we're talking about race in the 1860s and the struggle to end slavery, is if that's like exactly the same thing as like race in the context of talking about like racial disparity politics in the United States in 2023, I think is pretty misguided. And again, I think people end up sort of unwittingly giving cover to this kind of liberal race politics that's ultimately about representation and trying to have a more demographically diverse ruling class. And they'll sort of say, oh, but I support all that and socialism. I think they're often missing the ways in which those political ideologies in practice are at cross purposes with each other. And again, it's this idea that there's nothing that's not material. I think that's just using the word material in a way that is that intersects neither with what Marx meant by material in the sense of historical materialism, where he's really talking about forces and relations of production, or it also doesn't really intersect with what we're talking about with material issues when we talk about saying, well, it makes sense to emphasize the distribution of material resources and sort of universalist solutions to that as the primary thing to emphasize to try to get more people on board with a socialist program, so you can also then convince them of everything else that's important to us. All right, let's keep going.
It's a misreading of the text, okay? And I'm not normally the one to browbeat over theory, okay? But like it's very weird to me because it seems like a misinterpretation that always is conveniently applied to distract people from like social issues. I thought material here meant issue relating to everyday life. No, there's tons of stuff that even they would consider material that have nothing to do with everyday life, like say corporate tax law. And there's plenty of stuff that they would not consider to be material that does affect everyday life, like
Pudding Miser says, I'm in favor of universalist rights that include trans people. Yeah, me too. And if you think that you're disagreeing with me or anybody else here, I don't think you're trying very hard to listen to anything that anybody's saying. Let me just say that.
People in bathrooms, you know, just whatever. For me, it just seems like a long-winded way for reactionary Marxists to go, oh, well, we don't have to care about this minority group because it's an identity thing. You know, it's like a theory cloak that they can throw over an issue so they can go like, well, you know, we're concerned with the real issues. Except by real, I mean Marxist. And by Marxist, I mean my interpretation of the text. I don't think that Ben Burgis is like super reactionary or whatever. Nice. I guess, I mean, he does have class reductionist tendencies though. So I don't know.
Yeah, I really want to know what class reductionist tendencies means. Because, you know, class reductionism, I mean, I guess this came up in the super chat from Strom earlier. Sounds like it could mean a few different things. And I think people who throw around the term tend to sort of conflate all these together, but really they should be analytically separated, right? So one thing that class reductionism could mean is like it's an analytical claim that like certain other non-class issues ultimately reduce to class issues in the sense that like that's where they come from, or like in the way that we might say we might be like reductive materialists about minds, that we think that that like thoughts and feelings are ultimately about, you know, what's going on in your brain or input output functional systems or something like that. So that's like a very abstract claim that has no immediate bearing one way or the other for political questions. That would be compatible with just about anything you could say about political strategy or political morality or anything like that. So, I mean, the word reductionism kind of makes it sound like that, but I think what it really sounds like the accusation of class reductionism amounts to most of the time that people use it is it's an accusation of not really caring about anything but class, or sort of wanting to dissolve away everything else or something like that. So like oftentimes what it seems like people are being accused of when they're accused of class reductionism is like callous indifference to any issues except for like, I don't know, what goes on in the workplace, or, you know, social democratic economic policy things, or, you know, whatever, right? That like nothing else like morally matters. And I think if that's what you mean, then it's just a silly smear. Like, I want to know who's a class reductionist in that sense. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure you can find 10 guys, you know, on Reddit, you know, Cicero classically said that there's no position so absurd that some philosopher doesn't advocate it. And whether or not that's true about philosophers, it's certainly true about Reddit. That you can always find 10 guys on Reddit who will actually champion any absurdity that you want to come up with. But if you're talking about like major thinkers or even major commentators, even people who are major in whatever piddling sense that like yours truly would be or whatever, I don't think anybody's a class reductionist in that sense. Right. Adolf Reed, for example, has always been accused of class reductionism. Like, he's clearly not a class reductionist in the sense that he doesn't care about racism or, he doesn't care about sexism. I'm clearly not a class reductionist in that sense, etc. Again, I've written for Jacobin about abortion rights. I've written for Jacobin about the struggle for gay marriage in Cuba. I've written for Jacobin about why sweeping bans against puberty blockers are wrong. I mean, I think there's I think there is an empiric, I think there's a complicated argument to be had about some of these policies, not because of any need to say they aren't important or to throw anybody under the bus or anything like that, but just because the world is complicated and sometimes you have competing values at stake. So I don't know exactly how much, what the clinical standards should be or how much gatekeeping should be mandatory for puberty blockers or the sort of arguments that people will have about the, medical costs and, the medical risks and benefits or whatever. I'm largely going to be agnostic about all that because I just don't know enough. But a sweeping ban on it that said, no, it doesn't matter what doctors think, doesn't matter what families think. We're just going to have a sweeping ban. Again, I've written about that for Jacobin. I think that's very wrong. I said that on Joe Rogan, that I think that kind of sweeping ban is wrong. And similarly, for abortion, I wouldn't take the position, somebody who I guess will remain nameless for this. I saw them on a right-wing show, and they were arguing with the host about abortion rights, and they were biting all these crazy bullets, but yeah, it's fine up to even if it's 8 months, 29 days, and 18 hours, you can still have an abortion at that time. I think that's silly. I think you can admit to a little bit of nuance about some of these things, but yeah, the sort of basic moral questions, yes. I mean, if class reductionist means somebody who doesn't care about the sort of basic moral principles about abortion rights, about gay rights, about trans rights, etc., then yeah, I don't like class reductionism, but I also don't think anybody. I also think it's kind of a phantom. It's are the class reductionists in the room with you right now? Now, a third thing a class reductionist could mean. The first thing is that sort of dry, abstract, analytic point that doesn't really have political implications one way or the other. That everything reduces to class in the sense that it comes from class or something like that. Which, okay, I think there's some truth to that. I always think about the point that Barbara and Karen Fields make in Racecraft about how silly it is to talk about slavery as if the purpose of slavery was to produce white supremacy rather than to produce sugar, cotton, and tobacco. Or I kind of riff on that in my second book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, and say it's not like the British conquered India for the purpose of culturally appropriating their curry, right? These things do have, economic motivations, but I'm sure not unlimited truth, right? Because history is complicated, things take on lives of their own, etc. I do think that I do believe in what Benjamin Fong has a really good article in Damage Magazine called something like The Case for Socialist Minimalism, where he's look, you don't have to have an opinion about everything. The world is complicated. You don't have to sort of weigh in on every topic. You can have the sort of general socialist wager that there are a lot of other social problems that people can sort of work out for themselves once you meet their material needs and you give them the capacity to sort of act freely and act freely in the world and to have input into decision making and all that stuff. Then a lot of these things, not all of them, right? I mean, again, I think there's a certain amount of justified pessimism about how even an advanced socialist society would work. I don't think every social problem is going to wither away when capitalism ends, but a lot of them, I think that's a reasonable stance to take about. So class reductionism in the first sense is the analytical claim. Class reductionism in the second sense is the normative claim that like nothing except for class matters, that none of it is morally important. And in that sense, I agree, being a class reductionist would be bad, but also I think it's a straw man. Nobody's really class reductionist in that sense. Maybe 10 guys on Reddit, nobody else. And then a third sense of class reductionism, like I remember Noah Berlatsky wrote an article about me a couple of years ago where he accused, he said I was a class first leftist. And the way he defined it was more like that normative sense of class reductionism. Like, I don't think anything but class morally matters, which is a silly straw man. But then like look, saying class first, I mean, there's a sense in which I would agree with that, right? If what you just mean is like, yes, strategically, if you're trying to think about the levers that you have available to you to change society, then yeah, trying to mobilize the working class as a class and to sort of emphasize the issues that are the most unifying in the working class makes all the sense in the world from a strategic perspective. And by the way, every single one of those universalist policies disproportionately helps marginalized groups, right? If you're a trans person who is worried about housing or employment discrimination, who is worried about having access to healthcare, right? If you're on that lifelong regime of hormone replacement, like access to healthcare is hugely important, et cetera, then having things like universal healthcare where we take the profit motive out of it and, give access to anything the doctor thinks you need as a universal right, having things like very strong labor unions that make it harder to fire people, having things like very strong tenants unions and public housing to make it harder for landlords to kick you out of housing, all those things will disproportionately help you. So I think for all sorts of reasons, yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to sort of put a certain kind of strategic emphasis on class. That doesn't mean that everything else is like morally insignificant. That's a separate issue. Okay, I am, Stuart says, is class a well-defined topic? Well, people use the word to mean different things. I think a lot of sort of non-Marxist discourse about class just kind of I also see somebody saying that's not what Lance was saying. That you are right. That's what I was thinking of. The clip I watched, it sounded like it. If there's like a longer clip where it's clear that that's not what he's saying, then I'm open to hearing otherwise. I will say again that the clip I saw, it certainly seemed to be saying it. And his reaction to it on Twitter didn't really sound like he was backing off from it. But look, I don't, I think it's a mistake that like people often make in debates that because their goal is to like own the person they're arguing with rather than to try to appeal to the audience, that they don't want to concede anything because they think conceding things looks weak. It looked to me from the clip I saw like he was making that mistake. If I'm wrong about that, my apologies, but that's certainly what it looked like to me from the clip I watched. That's all I can say about that. Okay, so there's the chat saying, asking, okay, I can't find the chat. I had it highlighted earlier, but it asked whether class was well defined. And I would say, yeah, look, I think there's a lot of non-Marxist discourse about class where what people mean by class is like sort of how poor you are. And of course, I do care about poverty, but that's not what class means, right? Somebody who's if you think about like the new UPS contract, people are talking about, oh my God, can you believe how much money some of these people are making? Yeah, that's good, right? That's this is what you get from a strong union. Everybody should look at that and be like, yeah, I need a union like that. So so I could get paid a lot of money too. I always think about that Boondocks, the Hateocracy episode with the crabs who like get mad when the other crabs start to get out of the bucket and pull them back in. It's like, no, you should be happy that like some people with strong unions win lots of money and try to do the same thing yourself. But a UPS driver is still very much part of the working class. Or even if you think about stuff like the Hollywood strike, that people make a big deal of like some of the actors, so they see in picket lines being millionaires. And it's like, yeah, but like a millionaire actor seeing her interests as being aligned with the interests of an extra who's just struggling to pay for rent and groceries and, you know, stay in their one-bedroom apartment is a good thing, right? Like class doesn't mean income. Class means relationship to the means of production. And that I think actually is pretty well defined. Do you work for a living? Do you own the place? And, you know, I think sometimes people will make the mistake of sort of seeing this as a moral category. So they're like, ooh, but that would mean that like all these bad people count as part of the working class. Like, oh, would a scab count as part of the working class? Or what if your employer is like the Death Star? You know, it's like, yeah, that's not the point. Class is not a moral term. It's a term of analysis. Are you somebody who can't make a living through ownership of the means of production, but instead has to rent out your time to somebody who does own the means of production, because then by and large, your interests are going to be aligned with other people who do. And I think that is relatively well defined, I would argue. Okay. I wanted to. Oh yeah, there we go. That was the one I just responded to. Is class well-defined topic? Okay, let's watch some more Vaush.
What is not a material issue then? From a Marxist framework, anything that affects the world materially is a material issue.
Yeah, this could not be more wrong. It is not the case that from a Marxist perspective, anything that impacts the world is a material issue. That's not what material issue means when people are talking about social strategy, like the tweet. It's certainly not what material means when you're talking about historical materialism. This is just a complete misreading.
Like literally anything. A gender identity in a vacuum in one's head is not a material issue because it's purely in the head. But then if there's like public discourse or debate over the nature of gender and the social meaning of that role, that is now a material issue because it's affecting the dynamic between individuals and class, right? You should just don't. The term material issues should not actually be used as like an anti-identitarian talking point. It doesn't track. Keep in mind, again, the term material in the Marxist context is just a contrast to the Hegelian dialectic, okay? Hegel, when he presented his dialectic, was arguing that synthesis was achieved between iterations of people's ideologies, that society was all about having an ideology and having that idea challenged and reified in different directions until the internal contradictions result in some superior conclusion, you know, synthesis, right? Thesis, counter-thesis, synthesis, right? So that's the Hegelian dialectic. It's focused.
I'm not a Hegelian, obviously, but that's really not what Hegel thinks. For one thing, that phrase thesis, antithesis, synthesis doesn't appear in Hegel. That's just that's just a sort of preliminary point. And this kind of idea about the way he's describing about ideology and stuff, again, I think read some Hegel, read some writing about Hegel. I'm not going to try to do a whole Hegel thing here, but I really don't think this is a particularly accurate description of Hegel's idea of history. But regardless, I'm going to keep going.
Just on ideas. So a Hegelian might say, you know, well, we had an initial idea, right, which was American white supremacy, where white people are the only ones who can vote and own everything. But then we have a counter idea, which is the idea of like all men being created equal. So the contradiction between these two ideas clash against each other until eventually we arrive at synthesis, which is racial equality. And then Marx was like, that's stupid, dumbass. Hegel, stupid ass piece of shit. Why did I listen to your lectures?
Okay. Let's talk about that, right? Let's actually watch that last little bit again, because this is kind of remarkable.
These two ideas clash against each other until eventually we arrive at synthesis, which is racial equality. And then Marx was like, that's stupid, dumbass. Hegel, stupid ass piece of shit. Why did I listen to your lectures?
You know, it's funny. I mean, in a certain sense, my preferred kind of Marxism isn't really that Hegelian in the sense of using a lot of Hegelian terminology. Again, I've recommended G.A. Cohen, Karl Marx's Theory of History here a few times. Cohen's an analytic philosopher. He thinks it's very important to sort of translate things from Hegelese into sort of much clearer language. But this is just kind of painful just as a description of Marx's attitude, because you know who loved Hegel throughout his life? Karl Marx, right? Again, I think, you know, Hegel is certainly not a materialist. Hegel certainly is not somebody who understands the progress of history primarily in terms of these material factors, by which Marx does not mean everything that has anything to do with physical reality, but rather Marx means, you know, forces and relations of production. That's certainly not Hegel, right? Hegel is an idealist. He does think that that there is this, you know, there is this world spirit that's sort of, you know, coming into itself throughout history. But there's this profound influence that never goes away, right? So Marx, you know, starts to write recognizably, you know, Marxist stuff in the mid 1840s. You know, that even when you get stuff like on the Jewish question, you know, he's a good part of the way there. Very misunderstood pamphlet from people who sort of flip through it looking for shocking passages rather than thinking about what the overall argument is. I'm not going to make that argument here. But you know, Marx is on the side of Jewish emancipation and equality. And certainly once you get to like 1847, 1848, you have the Poverty of Philosophy, which actually I'm about to start reading with my class through the GTAA Patron this Sunday. And then 1848, you get the Communist Manifesto, is obviously most people who've read just like one thing by, you know, even Jordan Peterson's read that one, supposedly. But really Marx's masterpiece is Capital Volume 1 in 1867. Volumes 2 and 3 he leaves incomplete and sort of leaves to Engels to patch up and, you know, get ready for publication. But as far as what's like actually finalized and published in his lifetime, Capital Volume 1 in 1867 is sort of, again, that's his masterpiece. That's the definitive statement of Marxism. But that's even after that, right, in the 1870s, if, you know, he says, so I was looking for this quote the other day on Twitter, a couple of people found it for me. You know, he says, this is a note that he wrote in the 1870s, this, you know, for the second German edition of Capital. He says, my relationship with Hegel is very simple. I am a disciple of Hegel, and the presumptuous chattering of the epigones who think they have buried this great thinker appear frankly ridiculous to me. So again, I just want to contrast one more time.
Clash against each other until eventually we arrive at synthesis, which is racial equality. And then Marx was like, that's stupid, dumbass. Hegel, stupid ass piece of shit. Why did I listen to your lectures? Why did I read your shit? Ideas aren't what evolve. It's the material relations of the classes that evolve.
All right. So yeah, this is saying that Marx thought that Hegel was a dumbass, stupid piece of shit, I think is not especially accurate to what Marx thinks about Hegel. I just didn't want this stream to go by without making that point, right? Because I think it's a pretty significant point. Okay, so with that in mind, I do want to, StreamYard's being weird. I hope I'm not talking to myself right now, but I do want to keep going just a little bit longer here.
racial equality in the United States if it had been materially beneficial for all parties involved to maintain the oppression of Black people. It was through the power and prominence of Black people and the split between the North and the South, another material issue, and like so on and so on. And these things arose. These things brought about class conflict and literal warfare, literal military conflict. And that's what brought us eventually to what we're talking about today. You can who gave Black people rights in America? White people. So maybe they should be thankful. If you look at the reason why things shifted, Black people didn't get rights in America because white people just grew more enlightened with time. There was fighting over it. Internal and external pressure pushed against existing systems and eventually broke and bent things until racial equality was the more amenable idea. It was the material result of the conflict. A good example of this would be the fact that the Soviet Union put a lot of pressure on the United States abroad by accusing the United States of being racist. The Soviet Union, which was also racist, mind you, would publish international propaganda lambasting America for its racism against Black people, with the goal of alienating America from third world nations that were sympathetic to socialist ideals. So, one of the reasons why American politicians grew more insistent on the idea of maybe having a little more racial equality was because it was losing them ground in the international war against communism. Because other countries were like, why would we side with America? They're racist, They wouldn't like us. They wouldn't like us for our skin color. So, that's not like the idea growing, that's material conflict that pushes forward the dynamic. Of course, Mike from MA. Yeah, 100%. Black soldiers fighting and dying in World War I and World War II were expressions of their, investment in, of the American ideals, their participation.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into some of this. That's yeah. Again, I think that the sort of fundamental picture here of what material means to Marx, what it means in discussions of social strategy, etc., is just wrong. I think that saying that it's a joke, I think doesn't really work, right? That they have that's, the problem is, like, even if you're sort of treating it as a jokey exaggeration, you're still saying something inaccurate at the core of it, right? It doesn't work as a joke if the premise is wrong. Pudding Miser says, I wonder if Ben could have someone on stream who's more knowledgeable about the issue of trans healthcare. I certainly have. Most recently, I had Dr. Eric Osgood on for a long breakdown of Emma Viglin's appearance on on Tim Pool, and we got into like a lot of the subtleties of this, and certainly not the only time. I mean, it's a little bit frustrating because sometimes when I acknowledge the limits of my own knowledge about something, people are like, oh, you're uneducated, whatever. It's like, yeah, I don't actually think I know less about this than most of the lefty commentators who endlessly run their mouths about it. I think I'm just more willing to acknowledge some of those limitations. But in any case, let's watch. We're almost at the end of the whole video, so let's just watch the last little bit of Vaush here.
Participation in the nation as a whole. Look, okay, I'm sorry. I'm going off on a whole tangent here, okay? The point that I'm trying to get at is that Hegel is dumb and he writes too much, and he's probably an incel, and I don't care. And materialism is good. All right, sorry. Okay.
All right. Last comment we read Hegel. Definitely not an incel for better or worse. I believe he was married also before he got married. He famously knocked up his landlady, and there's a whole scandal about that. So whatever you want to, whatever criticisms you want to make of Hegel, incel is probably it's probably going to be off the table. But in any case, forget that. Forget that for now. Just want to say, sort of on the, and yeah, I really like that comment from Robbie. that with Marx being the epic poster that he was, we would for sure know that if you thought Hegel was a stupid bitch. Yeah, if you read like the Marx's letters to Engels, where he's going on about Bakunin, and he calls Bakunin a heaving mass of flesh who is pathetic and broken and all this stuff. It's like, yeah, he really didn't hold back about opinions like that when he held them. Okay. So yeah, StreamYard is being weird, but I think that so I'm having to look at YouTube for some of the comments right now. StreamYard isn't showing me for some weird reason. But there is somebody says God's dominatrix says Vaush got Marx confused with Nietzsche, though Nietzsche is superior in every way to Marx. Well, Nietzsche is superior in every way to Marx is almost the kind of thing that'll get you banned from this channel. But in an explosion of generosity, I'm not going to do that today. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of arguing in the chat about trans stuff. Again, I think that the small irony here is that I, and also, by the way, Anna, I think are probably much more on the side of the people with conventional progressive views about that overall than some people might think, because they sort of get very consumed with the politics of small differences. But again, that's probably enough about that. So unless there is anything else that hi Chili D, I might not have gotten your super chat. Again, StreamYard is being a little weird right now. It's not showing me all the chats. I don't know what's going on, but yeah, Chili D says, I don't know if you got my chat, but I'm a big fan of the channel. Really appreciate that. And yeah, sorry if I did not see that scrolling past me. Ryan says, Ben, what were your thoughts on Anna's Portugal drug piece? Yeah, my thoughts are that I wish people had watched it before they criticized it, because I think a lot of people were reacting to that as if she had said that Portugal's decriminalization was bad, when it seemed to me what she was actually saying there is that it was actually working quite well until it was defunded. And I think there were some nuances there, but I think that was, unless I'm very mistaken, I'll go back and watch again. But unless I'm very mistaken, that was kind of where that piece kind of ultimately ended up. That it's that the sort of core idea is good, but that they weren't funding these kinds of services that they needed to get it to continue to work. Great Gario says, doesn't matter if think people should have more rights, only matters you support them in action. Yeah, I guess I want to know what kind of actions you're thinking of, right? Is like tweeting an action, is denouncing the right people when one faction of Twitter gets mad at them in action, is like YouTubers talk about people on YouTube in action. All of this is commentary. This is an action. So I don't really understand the distinction there. I understand supporting an action if you're talking about things like should a DSA elected support oppose any kind of like anti-trans laws that come up in legislatures, I would say, of course. Or should like a union include, making sure that trans members get the healthcare they need in its list of demands. I certainly agree with that, but otherwise I'm a little confused about what action is being appealed to here that you're saying that Anna or anybody else isn't doing. Let's see. Yeah, sorry, I was laughing at some of the other stuff in chat. Obviously, what I just said isn't funny. So, yeah. Yeah, sounds like there's some very detailed very detailed parsing of what was said in this segment. Again, I think the overall point of it isn't what it was often portrayed as being, but ultimately, it's not my segment, it's not yours. I'm offering my interpretation, take it or leave it, but that's what I got out of it. Yeah, but nobody's. So the great Garia is talking about openly supporting policies. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know how much more open you can be than starting to tweet with I support progressive social policy issues, gay rights, trans rights, abortion rights, etc. I'm not suggesting that anybody hide their position. I am suggesting that there is a strategic conversation to be had about emphasis and sort of what's a more effective organizing tool. But again, those are just very different. Those are just very, very different claims. Yeah. All right. I think that's one bad faith comment too many there to keep responding to that particular user. That's maybe take a time out and think about what people are actually saying instead of just responding to things that are easier to argue against. But yeah, let's see. Chili D says, I feel like a lot of these disagreements can be resolved on the left by conversation. Yeah, I'm all for conversation. Again, I think, I think I get pretty sick of responding to people who say, oh, you must be saying such and such when I never said such and such. I never came close to saying such and such. But yeah, I'm all for actual conversation. Again, with that at the beginning of the video where Vaush says, hey, I guess I could just DM Ben Test, talk about it. I would probably say yes. Again, I would ask for a third-party moderator and a time limit and good stuff like that. But assuming we can work all that out, do it on the Vanguard or whatever, I'm perfectly happy to take that invitation. All right. Unless there are any other last-minute questions, this stream lasted 4 times as long as I was initially predicting it would. Honestly, I think I got much more mad about the misinterpretation of historical materialism than any of the more sort of politically immediate parts of this. But yeah, if anybody has any last-minute questions, I am happy to answer those now. Otherwise, we'll probably wrap up. Yeah. Let's see. Robbie H says, Ben, we just want you to be right. And by right, I mean agree with me. Lol. I'm just kidding, bro. It was a good stream today. Appreciate that. Yeah. A lot of discussion about who should debate who. Okay, I think this is probably, should probably end on this note right now instead of keeping on going. Stalin is really bad. That's my only comment on a lot of the rest of the stuff in the chat. But in any case, yeah, I think, again, I'm all for conversation. I think that I think that sort of eagerness to denounce each other over relatively minor disagreements is really counterproductive. And I have definitely grown less patient with that over the last few years. That when I think people are just sort of very eager to rush from disagreement to denunciation in order to prove their own sort of in-group credentials. I'm not particularly patient with that. That's one of the reasons why, there are other critiques from other people who I haven't necessarily responded to. I thought this video from Vaush was mostly fine. I think he's wrong, right? But it's not like, it didn't really strike me like that. So that's why I am probably willing to take that conversation if we can work out with the details. But on that note, I think it is finally time to wrap up this this extremely long conversation for today. Just as far as what's coming up in the near future. So on Thursday, we are going to be following up on last week's debate breakdown. I'm going to have Jordan Dubin and Matt Whalen, who were both on last week, back on, and also Rob Larson this time. And we are going to watch Noam Chomsky's 2005 debate on Israel with Alan Dershowitz. Should be fun, again, especially coming after last week. Just as a reminder, we are doing Patron postgames for the debate breakdowns now. And also, if you are a GTAA patron, you get the podcast version of the debate breakdowns as well as the postgames. We're not putting any of that on the sort of main feed. So, and obviously you also get the main show on Mondays, and the post games after the main shows on Mondays, and the Discord server, and decent amount of exclusive content here and there. But mostly you get our eternal love and gratitude for helping to keep this thing going. So I think I am going to finally clock out on that note, take my dog for a walk, get some writing done for Jacobin. Did just want to address all of this. So I will Chomsky Dershowitz debate was in 2005, if that's what you're asking, but we're going to watch it on Thursday. So I will see people then. Thank you for watching. Hope people got something out of the stuff that I think actually matters much more about so-called class reductionism, about what historical materialism is and isn't, and all of that, and not just the kind of, media personalities arguing about other media personality stuff, which really should not be the top line story. So I will see people on Thursday. Left is best.